I've spent my whole life surrounded by color. The deep, velvety crimson of a Grand Prix rose. The piercing blue of a delphinium. But then, the petals didn't end opos. Tea just wilt. They turned to ash, right before my eyes. I was holding a bouquet of lilies, and suddenly, I realized I couldn't end opos. Tea see the white anymore. I couldn't end opos. Tea even see the light. That was the moment I understood. Everything I thought was beautiful. It was the first thing to leave me. It was a Friday afternoon, the kind where the shop smells like damp earth and cut stems. I was in the storage room, the walk-in cooler, actually. I was prepping orchids for a wedding on Saturday. The air in there is always sharp, cold enough to keep the blooms from opening too soon. I remember reaching for the floral tape, and my fingers felt like they belonged to someone else. I looked down at a bunch of baby's breath on the table. Usually, they look like tiny clouds, but they started to turn gray, not a shadow, but like the life was being sucked out of the color itself. I felt a strange, heavy vibration in the back of my neck. It wasn't opos, a headache. It was a rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. I tried to step toward the heavy steel door, but the floor felt like it was made of sponges. I remember thinking, and quote, I didn't end opos. Drink enough water today, end quote. I leaned against the metal shelving. The coldness of the steel usually stings, but I felt nothing. Then, the orchids, those beautiful, vibrant purple orchids, they just faded. The world became a black and white movie with the brightness turned all the way down. I heard the hum of the cooling fan, and then, the sound stretched out, becoming a long, low moan. I reached out to grab a bucket for support, but my hand just passed through the air. The vibration in my neck, it turned into a roar. I felt my body arching, my spine stiffening like the stem of a dried flower. There was no pain, just a terrifying pressure, like I was being squeezed out of my own skin. I saw the glass vases on the shelves shaking, or maybe it was just my eyes vibrating in their sockets. Then, the darkness didn't end opos, fall. It rose. It started at my feet and swallowed the room, inch by inch. I tried to gasp for air, but the cold of the storage room was gone. Everything was gone. The smell of the roses vanished. The feeling of my own tongue in my mouth, gone. I was no longer a woman, or a florist, or Megan. I was just a point of awareness in a void that had no beginning and no end. I felt the last thread of my connection to that cold room snap. Snap, like a wire under too much tension. And then, the roar stopped. The pressure vanished. I was floating in a silence so deep, it felt like a physical weight. I thought, and quote, so, this is the part they never tell you about, end quote. Not the end, but the great pause. The silence, it was actually a frequency. I felt myself rising, but not like a balloon, more like steam. I looked down, and I was staring at the top of the industrial refrigerator. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and a lost pair of pruning shears I'd been looking for since last spring. Then I saw her. There was a woman slumped on the floor, her back against the flower crates. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her mouth was slightly open. A bucket of white lilies had tipped over next to her, the water soaking into her apron. I watched the water spread. I watched the petals of the lilies bruise and turn brown against the cold floor. I felt a strange, hollow realization. I spent my life trying to make things beautiful, trying to stop the wilting, trying to hide the decay. But looking at my own body, I realized I was just another flower that had reached its season. There was no fear. There was no end quote. Oh no, I and opos am dying, end quote. It was just end quote. Oh, that and opos, s over, end quote. I saw my cell phone on the table, vibrating with a text message. I could see the name on the screen. It was my sister. The person I hadn't and opos, spoken to in 3 years. Seeing her name didn't and opos, make me angry anymore. It made me feel heavy, like I was carrying an anchor made of old, dead petals. And then, the walls of the cooler began to glow, not from the lights, but from the edges of reality itself. The storage room didn't and opos, disappear. It just stopped being solid. I was being pulled toward a horizon that wasn't and opos, a place, but a feeling. The gray world of the cooler snapped, like a film reel breaking. I was standing, not on a floor, but on a foundation of warmth. The air itself was gold. It was a thick, liquid light that didn't and opos, just shine on me. It breathed through me. Everything I had ever felt, The stress of the shop, the debt, the exhaustion, it all fell away like dried leaves. And then, I felt a presence. It wasn't Apos, a person with a face. It was an ocean of energy. In that light, I saw the face of my sister again. But I didn't Apos, see her through my eyes. I saw her through her pain. I felt the reason she had said those cruel things 3 years ago. I felt her fear, her own sense of being lost, and the resentment I'd been nursing, that cold, hard knot I carried in my chest, just dissolved. It didn't Apos, make sense to be angry anymore. It felt like being angry at a storm for being wet. The central emotion was pure, overwhelming forgiveness. I realized that we are all just flowers trying to bloom in a very difficult garden. The voice, it was more like a vibration in my soul, said, "You were so worried about the petals that you forgot the roots." I saw that beauty isn and Apos, something you arrange in a vase. It's the invisible connection between us. I felt a love so heavy it was almost unbearable, a love that said everything was already okay. I didn't Apos, want to leave. I wanted to bury myself in that gold and never breathe air again. But then, a sound pierced the gold. It was the scream of the storage room door being flung open. The return was violent. It wasn't Apos, a transition, it was a collision. 1 second, I was a part of the sun. The next, I was choking on the freezing, sterile air of the cooler. My lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. I heard my delivery driver, Pete, shouting my name. His hands were on my shoulders, shaking me, but I couldn't Apos, feel his touch. I could only feel the cold. End quote. "Megan, stay with me, Megan," end quote. I wanted to tell him that I was fine, that I had seen the gold, but my body was a heavy, broken machine. I looked at the white lilies on the floor, now crushed beneath Pete's boots. I didn't Apos, feel sad for them anymore. I knew their essence hadn't Apos, changed just because their petals were bruised. It took months for my brain to feel like mine again. But my heart, it never went back to the way it was. I closed the shop for a week after I got out of the hospital. The first thing I did was call my sister. I didn't Apos, wait for an apology. I didn't Apos, list the things she'd done wrong. I just said, end quote, "I Apos, am sorry for holding on to the weeds," end quote. She cried. I cried. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was actually breathing. I still work with flowers every day, but I don't Apos, obsess over the perfection of the bloom anymore. I look at the wilting edges, the thorns, the dirt on the roots, and I see the beauty in all of it. The first thing I lost when I died was the illusion of end quote, pretty, end quote. And the first thing I gained when I came back was the truth of what is beautiful.